Admiral Kiichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, watching the morning sun paint the Pacific waters in shades of gold and crimson. It was June 4th, 1942, and the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled by the Empire of Japan cut through the waves toward a tiny atoll called Midway. The 6-month string of victories since Pearl Harbor had made the Japanese fleet seemingly invincible, but today would shatter that illusion forever. The morning air crackled with radio chatter as over 300 aircraft prepared for what Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto believed would be the decisive blow against American naval power in the Pacific. For massive aircraft carriers, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu formed the spearhead of an armada that included battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. Never before had such concentrated naval might sailed under the rising sun flag. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fukita, the same pilot who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, felt the familiar surge of adrenaline as he prepared his aircrew for the assault on Midway's defenses. The intelligence reports indicated minimal American resistance, a few outdated fighters, and some ground installations that would crumble under the weight of Japanese firepower. What they didn't know was that American codebreakers had been reading their encrypted messages for weeks, 1,500 miles away. Admiral Chester Nimitz sat in his Pearl Harbor headquarters, studying the intercepts that had revealed Yamamoto's entire battle plan. The Americans knew exactly when and where the Japanese would strike, turning what should have been a surprise attack into a carefully orchestrated trap. 3 American aircraft carriers, Harriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown had already taken position northeast of Midway. Hidden beyond the horizon and waiting, the first wave of Japanese bombers launched at 4:30 in the morning, engines roaring to life in the pre-dawn darkness. As they disappeared into the distance toward Midway, Nagumo felt confident that within hours, American resistance in the Central Pacific would be crushed. The Japanese had overwhelming superiority in numbers, experience, and equipment. What could possibly go wrong, according to Naval History and Heritage Command Archives? The Japanese strike force represented the pinnacle of carrier aviation development. With veteran pilots who had honed their skills in China and the early Pacific campaigns, but confidence bred complacency, and complacency would prove fatal. On Midway itself, radar operators detected the incoming Japanese formation while it was still over 100 miles away. Air raid sirens wailed across the tiny island as Marines and Navy personnel scrambled to their battle stations. The aging Buffalo fighters that rose to meet the Japanese attack were hopelessly outclassed. But they bought precious time for the real battle to begin, as the first bombs fell on Midways, runways, and installations. American torpedo bombers and dive bombers were already airborne from the 3 carriers, racing toward the Japanese fleet. The stage was set for the most decisive naval battle in Pacific history, a battle that would transform hunters into hunted and shift the entire momentum of World War II. The thunder of engines filled the morning sky as 2 great naval powers rushed toward their collision with destiny. The attack on Midway proceeded exactly as planned for the first hour. Lieutenant Commander Joichi Tominaga led his formation of dive bombers and fighters in devastating strikes against the American installations. Watching hangars explode and orange fireballs and runways crater under the weight of high explosives, anti-aircraft fire peppered the sky like deadly confetti. But the experienced Japanese pilots pressed their attacks with surgical precision. At 7 o'clock in the morning, Tominaga's voice crackled over the radio to Admiral Nagumo aboard the Akagi. There is need for a second attack. The message would prove to be one of the most consequential radio transmissions in naval history. Midway's defenses were damaged but not destroyed, and Tominaga could see American aircraft still taking off from the battered airfield. Nagumo faced a critical decision that would haunt him for the brief remainder of his life. Half of his aircraft were already armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for anti-ship warfare, ready to strike any American naval forces that might appear. But Tominaga's request meant he should rearm them with high-explosive bombs for a second land attack. The process would take at least an hour, during which his fleet would be vulnerable. At 7:15, Nagumo made his choice. Prepare to carry out attacks on enemy fleet units, he ordered. Re-equip the attack planes with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes. Hundreds of sailors swarmed across the flight decks of all 4 carriers, frantically moving ammunition in a deadly ballet of organized chaos. Armor-piercing bombs were lowered into storage while high-explosive ordnance was brought up from the magazines. Unknown to Nagumo, disaster was already racing toward him from 3 directions. The American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown had launched every available aircraft at dawn, sending over 150 planes in desperate attacks against the Japanese fleet. The obsolete Devastator torpedo bombers led the charge, flying so low their propellers almost touched the wave tops. At 9:25, the first American attack wave found the Japanese carriers. 15 Devastators from Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8 approached the Akagi in a textbook anvil formation, their crews knowing they faced almost certain death. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron had trained his men for this moment, and they pressed their attack with suicidal courage despite overwhelming odds. The slaughter was horrific and complete. Japanese Zero fighters fell upon the slow, lumbering torpedo bombers like hawks attacking sparrows. One by one, the Devastators burst into flames and crashed into the Pacific. Of the 15 aircraft in Torpedo Squadron 8, only one survived in St. George Gay, who would spend the next 30 hours floating in the ocean, watching the battle unfold from his life raft. But the sacrifice of the torpedo bombers achieved something crucial beyond their ability to deliver effective attacks. They drew the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, leaving the high-altitude approaches undefended. The deck crews were still frantically rearming aircraft when the next wave of American attackers appeared, dive bombers that approached from directly overhead. The moment that would change the course of World War II was now. Only minutes away, on the flight decks of 4 Japanese carriers, aviation fuel, high explosives, and armor-piercing weapons created a deadly mixture waiting for the spark that would ignite the largest naval disaster in Japanese history. The fatal hesitation was about to exact its terrible price. At 10:24 in the morning, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey spotted the white wakes of the Japanese fleet far below his formation of dive bombers from the Enterprise. For over an hour, he had led his squadron through empty ocean, searching for an enemy that seemed to have vanished into the vastness of the Pacific. Fuel gauges showed dangerously low levels, and many pilots wondered if they would have enough gas to return to their carrier. But there they were, 4 aircraft carriers steaming in perfect formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft. Being prepared for launch, McCluskey had found the heart of the Japanese striking force at the exact moment when it was most vulnerable. He pushed his dive bomber into a steep angle of attack and spoke into his radio microphone. Attack immediately. Admiral Nagumo stood on Akagi's bridge, watching his crews work with desperate efficiency to complete the rearming process. Intelligence reports indicated no American carriers in the area, yet his ships had been under constant attack for over an hour. Where were these aircraft coming from? The answer would soon become terrifyingly clear as American dive bombers screamed down from the morning sky like falling meteors. The first bomb struck Akagi's flight deck at 10:26, penetrating deep into the hangar deck before exploding among the rearmed aircraft waiting for launch. Aviation fuel ignited in a sheet of flame that raced across the enclosed space, detonating bombs and torpedoes in a chain reaction of destruction. Within seconds, the pride of the Japanese fleet had become a floating inferno. Simultaneously, dive bombers from Yorktown and Enterprise attacked the carriers Kaga and Soryu with devastating effect. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led his squadron against Kaga, placing his bombs with precision that turned the massive carrier into a blazing wreck. The Soryu suffered 3 direct hits in rapid succession, her flight deck buckling under the impact of 1,000-pound bombs that found their mark among fully fueled aircraft. According to accounts preserved in the National Archives, the scene aboard the Japanese carriers defied description as explosions rippled through their hulls like thunder rolling across the ocean. Men were blown overboard by the force of secondary detonations, while others fought desperately to contain fires that fed on aviation fuel and high explosives. The magnificent aircraft that had dominated Pacific skies for 6 months became twisted metal scattered across blood-stained decks. In the aftermath of Midway, the Japanese High Command struggled to comprehend the magnitude of their defeat while simultaneously attempting to conceal it. from both their own people and the watching world. Admiral Yamamoto's return to Tokyo bore no resemblance to the triumphant homecoming that had been planned for the architect of American naval destruction. Dead, found himself explaining to Emperor Hirohito how the supposedly invincible combined fleet had suffered its first major defeat in over 3 centuries. The human cost of the battle staggered even veteran naval officers accustomed to the brutal arithmetic of warfare. Japan had lost over 3,000 men, including some of the most experienced carrier pilots in the world. These were not replaceable assets men like Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Ateya. The Pearl Harbor veteran who died when Akagi exploded represented years of training and combat experience that could not be quickly recreated in flight schools. Back home, Captain Mitsuo Fukita, the Pearl Harbor attack leader who had been hospitalized with appendicitis during the battle, later wrote of his shock at learning of the disaster. Pilots he had trained and fought alongside for years were gone, along with the carriers that had been their homes. The Pearl Harbor strike force, which had seemed invincible just 6 months earlier, has been destroyed in a single day of combat against an enemy they had underestimated. American codebreakers at Pearl Harbor, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had provided Admiral Nimitz with the intelligence advantage that made victory possible. By reading Japanese naval communications, they had turned Yamamoto's carefully planned surprise attack into a devastating trap. The same arrogance that had led to Pearl Harbor now contributed to Japan's greatest naval defeat as overconfident commanders walked into an ambush they never saw coming. The strategic implications of Midway reverberated far beyond the immediate loss of ships and aircraft. Japan's ability to maintain offensive operations across the vast Pacific had depended on carrier-based aviation, and those carriers now lay at the bottom of the ocean. The planned invasion of Australia would have to be postponed indefinitely, while American industrial production began flooding the Pacific with new ships, planes, and weapons. Admiral Chester Nimitz understood immediately that Midway represented more than a tactical victory. It was the turning point that would allow American forces to begin their long march across the Pacific toward Japan itself. The carriers Enterprise and Hornet, along with their veteran air groups, has proven that American naval aviation could not only match the Japanese skill, but exceed it when properly led and equipped. According to contemporary accounts from the Office of Naval Intelligence, Japanese morale throughout the Pacific Fleet suffered a devastating blow as news of the disaster spread. Despite official censorship attempts, the myth of invincibility that had sustained Japanese expansion since Pearl Harbor was shattered, replaced by the growing realization that American industrial capacity and fighting spirit posed a mortal threat to the empire. The psychological impact on Japanese naval aviators proved particularly severe. Surviving pilots from Hiryu and the other carriers spoke of fighting an enemy that seemed to anticipate their every move, as if the Americans possessed supernatural knowledge of Japanese intentions. The reality that superior intelligence and code-breaking had provided crucial advantages remained hidden from most. Japanese commanders throughout the war, in the weeks following Midway, Japanese shipyards worked frantically to replace the lost carriers, but new ships could be built far more quickly than experienced pilots could be trained. The veterans who had made Japanese naval aviation so formidable in the war's early months were irreplaceable, and their loss would handicap Japanese operations for the remainder of the conflict. The rising sun was setting on Japanese naval supremacy, and everyone from Emperor Hirohito to the lowliest seaman began to sense that the war had taken a decisive turn against them. 6 months after, Pearl Harbor had awakened the sleeping giant of American industrial might. The Battle of Midway demonstrated that the giant was not only awake, but ready to fight with unprecedented fury and efficiency. The same nation that had been caught unprepared in December 1941 had transformed itself into a war machine capable of defeating the world's most experienced naval aviators on their own terms. Admiral Yamamoto's grand strategy lay in ruins on the floor of the Pacific Ocean, along with 4 aircraft carriers, over 250 aircraft, and the cream of Japanese naval aviation. The man who had warned his government that attacking America would awaken a terrible enemy had seen his prophecy fulfilled in the most devastating manner possible. Japan could win battles he had predicted, but could not win a long war against. American industrial capacitant Midway proved him tragically correct. The battle's aftermath revealed the fundamental differences between Japanese and American approaches to naval warfare. Where Japan had relied on elite pilots trained to perfection, but difficult to replace, America was already developing training programs designed to produce competent aviators in massive numbers. The dauntless dive bomber pilots who had destroyed the Japanese carriers at Midway were not super warriors, but ordinary Americans transformed by intensive training and superior intelligence into an unstoppable force. Captain Richard Best, whose bomb had sunk the Akagi, represented the new breed of American naval aviator, technically proficient, tactically flexible, and backed by the world's most powerful industrial base. His successful attack demonstrated that American pilots could match Japanese skill when given proper equipment and accurate intelligence about enemy positions and intentions. The strategic balance in the Pacific had shifted decisively. The war was far from over. Japanese forces still controlled vast territories from the Aleutian Islands to the Solomon Islands, and their army remained largely intact despite the naval disaster at Midway. However, without carrier air cover, Japanese expansion was effectively finished, and American planners could begin developing the island-hopping campaign that would eventually reach Japan itself. The human stories emerging from Midway illustrated both the horror and heroism of modern naval combat. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, spent 30 hours floating in the Pacific while watching the battle unfold around him. His rescue and subsequent testimony provided invaluable intelligence about Japanese damage control procedures and tactical formations that would prove useful in future engagements. According to post-war interviews conducted by naval historians, Japanese survivors of Midway spoke with grudging respect for American fighting spirit and tactical innovation. The torpedo bomber crews who had pressed their attacks despite hopeless odds earned particular admiration from enemy pilots who understood the courage required to fly obsolete aircraft against overwhelming opposition. The Battle of Midway had lasted only for days, but its consequences would shape the remainder of World War II in the Pacific. Japan's offensive capability was broken, while American confidence soared as news of the victory spread across a nation hungry for good news after 6 months of defeats and setbacks. The industrial capacity that would ultimately win the war was already beginning to manifest itself in new ships, aircraft, flowing toward the Pacific theater. Admiral Nimitz's final assessment proved prophetic. The Japanese came to Midway seeking decisive battle. They found it. The decisive battle had indeed occurred, but not in the manner Yamamoto had envisioned. Instead of destroying American naval power, Japan had lost its own ability to project force across the Pacific, ensuring that the rising sun would continue setting until it finally disappeared beneath the waves of Tokyo Bay on September 2nd, 19. When the war officially ended aboard the battleship Missouri, the moment when Japanese forces buckled had arrived, and with it came the beginning of the end for the Empire of the Rising Sun. Captain Jisaku Okada of the Kaga watched in horror as his ship's island structure collapsed in a tangle of burning steel. Hundreds of his crew were trapped below decks, their escape routes blocked by wreckage and flame. The carrier that had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor was dying, taking with her some of the most experienced naval aviators in the world. On the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo reluctantly transferred his flag to a cruiser as his flagship burned out of control. The man who had led the Pearl Harbor attack now watched his career and his fleet consumed by American bombs delivered with the same precision his pilots had once shown over Oahu. 3 of his 4 aircraft carriers were blazing wrecks. The 4th Hiryu was fighting alone against overwhelming odds in the space of 5 minutes. The balance of naval power in the Pacific had shifted decisively. The Japanese mobile force, which had seemed invincible just hours before, was suffering the most catastrophic defeat in the history of naval aviation. But the battle was far from over, and Hiryu's remaining aircraft were already launching a desperate counterattack that would exact a terrible price from the Americans. The 5 minutes from 10:24 to 10:29, 1942, would be remembered as the moment when American industrial might and fighting spirit overcame Japanese tactical superiority and turned the tide of World War II. In the Pacific, Captain Tomio Kaku stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Hiryu, the sole survivor of Nagumo's once mighty striking force, and watched black smoke billowing from his three sister ships. The morning sun, which had risen on Japanese naval supremacy, now illuminated a scene of unprecedented disaster. But Kaku was not a man to surrender while his ship remained capable of fighting, and Hiryu still carried enough aircraft to strike back at the Americans who had dealt this devastating blow. At 10:40, even as his companion carriers burned on the horizon, Kaku launched the first of two retaliatory strikes. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters toward the American fleet, determined to exact vengeance for the destruction of the mobile force. These were veteran pilots who had fought from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean, and they approached their mission with the grim professionalism of men who knew they were likely flying to their deaths. The American carriers had not escaped unscathed from their morning victory. Yorktown, the most battle-damaged of Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher's 3 flat tops, struggled to maintain formation while her crew worked frantically to repair damage from previous encounters. Her radar operators detected the incoming Japanese strike while it was still 50 miles away. But there was little time to prepare adequate defenses. At noon, Kobayashi's dive bombers found their target. Despite heavy anti-aircraft fire that filled the sky with deadly metal fragments, 3 bombs struck Yorktown's flight deck in rapid succession. The explosions knocked out her radar and communications systems, started serious fires in her hangar deck, and killed dozens of sailors who had been manning their battle stations with courage born of desperation. But American damage control had evolved far beyond Japanese expectations during the 6 months since Pearl Harbor. Within an hour, Yorktown's repair crews had her steaming at 20 knots and preparing to recover aircraft. 2 Japanese reconnaissance pilots observing from a distance appeared to be a different, undamaged carrier, crucial intelligence. Failure that would doom the next attack wave. At 2:30 in the afternoon, Hiryu launched her final strike. 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters under Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, the same pilot who had requested the second attack on Midway. That morning, Tominaga knew his fuel tank had been holed by American fire during the dawn raid, giving him barely enough gas for a one-way mission. He would not be returning to his carrier. The second attack on Yorktown achieved what the first had failed to accomplish. Despite the sacrifice of her defending fighters, 2 Japanese torpedoes struck the carrier's port side, flooding her engine rooms and bringing her to a dead stop. Admiral Fletcher was forced to transfer his flag to a cruiser as his flagship began, listing heavily to port, apparently doomed as the afternoon wore on. American search planes finally located the Hiryu steaming alone on the vast Pacific. Admiral Raymond Spruance, now in tactical command of the American striking force, launched every available aircraft from Enterprise and Hornet in a final assault against the last operational Japanese carrier. The Dragon was about to receive its death blow. According to official U.S. Navy records held at the Naval History and Heritage Command, the attack on Hiryu began at 5 o'clock in the evening as 24 dive bombers from Enterprise screamed down from the darkening sky for direct hits, turned the carrier into another blazing inferno, sealing the fate of Japan's carrier striking force and ending any hope of victory at Midway. Captain Kaku remained on his bridge as Hiryu died around him, choosing to go down with his ship rather than face the shame of survival. The last of Nagumo's carriers would sink the following morning, taking with her the dreams of Japanese naval supremacy and leaving the Pacific open to American counterattack. The tropical night of June 4th to 5th, 1942 witnessed the death throes of the Japanese carrier force as 3 burning giants slowly settled into the Pacific depths. Akagi, once the pride of the Imperial Navy and flagship of the Pearl Harbor attack, fought a losing battle against the fires that raged through her hull like demons unleashed from the depths of hell itself. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring the disaster from his flagship Yamato hundreds of miles away, received reports that read like entries in a catalog of naval catastrophe. Akagi on fire and unnavigable. Kaga burning fiercely, ammunition exploding. Soryu listing heavily, preparing to abandon ship. The architect of Pearl Harbor watched his masterpiece crumble in the space of a single day, his dreams of decisive victory transforming into the nightmare of unprecedented defeat. Captain Taijiro Aoki of the Kaga made the agonizing decision to abandon ship at 4:30 in the afternoon. The carrier that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months was now a floating furnace, her aluminum superstructure melting in temperatures that exceeded 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Survivors described the scene as apocalyptic men leaping into oil-slicked waters to escape the inferno, their ship's death rattle echoing across the ocean as magazines continued to explode deep within her hull. The Soryu died first, rolling over and sinking at 7:13 in the evening after Captain Ryu Saku Yanagiyamoto chose to go down with his ship. Legend claims he was last seen on the bridge singing the Japanese national anthem as the Pacific closed over his head. Whether true or not, the story captured the tragic nobility of men who had served their empire with honor but found themselves overwhelmed by forces beyond their control. Meanwhile, the drama aboard Yorktown continued as American damage control teams fought to save their wounded carrier. The ship that Japanese pilots believed they had sunk twice remained stubbornly afloat, her crew working with the desperate efficiency that would characterize American naval operations throughout the war. Pumps labored to control flooding while welders sealed ruptured bulkheads and electricians restored power to vital systems. Admiral Fletcher's decision to abandon Yorktown proved premature as Captain Elliot Buckmaster and a volunteer crew reboarded the carrier the following morning, determined to save their ship. For nearly 24 hours it appeared their efforts might succeed as the veteran flat top showed signs of stabilizing. But Japanese submarine I-168, prowling the waters like a hungry shark, had other plans. At dawn on June 6th, Commander Yahachi Tanabe fired 4 torpedoes at the seemingly abandoned American carrier. It struck home, delivering the coup de grace that American bombs and torpedoes had failed to achieve. Yorktown finally succumbed to her wounds at 5 in the morning on June 7th, taking with her the destroyers Hamon, which had been providing power and pumping assistance. The Hiryu lingered longest of all the Japanese carriers, her crew fighting fires through the night in a desperate attempt to save their ship. Captain Kaku and Admiral Tomoe Yamaguchi, the aggressive carrier division commander who had opposed the attack on Midway, chose to remain aboard as their vessel slowly died around them. Both men understood that survival would mean facing court-martial and national disgrace for their role in Japan's greatest naval disaster, according to wartime records preserved in Japanese naval archives. Hiryu finally rolled over and sank at 9 in the morning on June 5th, carrying with her the last hopes of Japanese naval aviation dominance. Of the 4 great carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor, 3 now rested on the Pacific floor, while the 4th Kagawood joined them before noon. The giants were dead, and with them died Japan's ability to project naval power across the vast expanses of the Pacific Ocean. The rising sun flag would continue to fly over many islands and territories, but never again would Japanese carriers operate with the impunity they had enjoyed during the 6 months following Pearl Harbor.